blockchains as a mechanism for global nonviolent consensus. And this is something that our human species has not ever had before.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to chat about blockchain and crypto and all the exciting things going on in the EOS world. To start out, just tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got started in the space. And yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. My name is Stokes, and I am a technologist, I guess, from background. I built my first websites in 1996. I majored in computer science. Was really excited about the whole space. I ran an e-commerce company for a while, so I was familiar with the payment space and how that all works. And then in, I guess it'd be 2013, beginning of 2013, I bought my first Bitcoin. I spent $50 and I got 2.5 Bitcoin. So that was my introduction to this. And at the time, it was still kind of on the verge of being fake internet money. But I remember seeing, I think it was anonymous. They had a Bitcoin address on their Twitter account, and I was like, wow, those people are not stupid. They're, we may disagree with everything they do, but or different things that they do, but they're not stupid. They're pretty smart. And if they trust this fake internet money as being a real value store, I was like, this is interesting. I should look into it. And from there, I just kind of followed Bitcoin quite a bit. Started a Bitcoin meetup in Nashville back in 2013. I did a Barcamp presentation about how Bitcoin was going to be more disruptive than the internet. I still believe that today, more than 6 years later. We started, it was just interesting. So the whole kind of story from there with the 2014 crash down from $1,200 down to $250, really fizzled out the community locally. And I was a little frustrated. I'm like, this is going to be the thing for mass adoption. It's going to change the world. This cryptocurrency, it's so important. And then I didn't see it happen. So then through that process, eventually 2 different friends of mine at the same time told me about Steam, which is a cryptocurrency based on building a social media platform. And so I got involved with Steam, started posting on the blockchain, and got excited again about how, and this was in 2016, about how anyone can use cryptocurrency. Anyone knows how to do a Medium post or post on Facebook or Reddit and all that. And kind of through that process, eventually got introduced to BitShares and eventually EOS because Dan Larimer is involved in building all that. And yeah, the rest is history. We'll get into all those details, but that's me in a nutshell.
That's awesome. So you are definitely, I remember learning about this stuff back in 2010. I went to Austrian economics, Mises University, and I remember we all debated whether or not this would go anywhere. And actually, the consensus at the time was no, it won't, because it didn't meet all the requirements for our money. But it actually does meet all those requirements, but we weren't technical. Our backgrounds weren't in tech, and so we just didn't really quite get it. So. But you've been in the space for a long time. That's always fun to talk about. You've sort of seen all of these, the booms and busts, if you will, or the scares, and how many times has Bitcoin died, right? And resurrected.
One of my favorite things, to go to that website and look at the Bitcoin obituaries. Whenever someone's like, wait, have you seen this article? And all through 2013, 2014, people would send me these, and I would just send them to that website and be like, yep, it's probably the 400th, 500th time it's died. And it is funny. I have some friends also in that kind of space, especially old, gold bugs and stuff that eventually come around to recognizing, wait, money has always been a ledger. And this is like the best ledger ever invented. So maybe it can work as money. And it's fun too. There's interesting projects that are always advancing forward to even improve on, for example, the fungibility of Bitcoin. Like there's some concerns with maybe it's not so fungible now because you can track them and decide these are bad coins and these are good coins. So it's an ever expanding experiment. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it is cool. And so our channel really is designed to help, we want to provide the person who knows the space with interesting stuff, but really we exist to help my mom and people who really don't understand the first thing about cryptocurrencies or are learning. We really want to help that person learn about this exciting space, these exciting technologies, and the different projects out there. And so you're somebody I've looked up to in the space, and I always appreciate, I follow all your posts, and I always learn a lot. And so I thought, hey, if you could help us understand some of these things, that would be awesome. So I got a couple questions for you. And so the first thing I wanted to ask is philosophical, and that is, why is crypto important? And blockchain important philosophically? So love to hear your answer there.
I love the question because it's the perfect place to start. It's the reason why I'm even in this space, why I'm excited about why I sold my business in 2018 to focus full time on the cryptocurrency space after 10 years running my own business with my business partner. This is what I'm passionate about. And the reason for that for me personally is I look at blockchains as a mechanism for global nonviolent consensus. And this is something that our human species has not ever had before. And importantly, generally, hierarchies are the most efficient ways to organize things throughout nature. You see this often. But then there's this shift now where our technology is enabling us to be a network that can be just as efficient as a hierarchy. So instead of being the traditional kind of nation state system, we have a hierarchy that's backed by essentially a threat of force. And most people, even if they love government, will agree that a nation state government is essentially a monopoly on the initiation of force in a geographic region. This is kind of what separates it from your HOA or, your bowling club, they get to use violence and no one else does, basically. And the more I kind of look into how that has influenced us historically as a species, really, the more I want to see something better. And so when I think about the ability to have a immutable record and by immutable, that's just a fancy word to say it's something you can't change. Nobody can tamper with it. They can't tweak it. It's just set in stone. It's solid. This historical record of transactions, or in the future, even more complicated interactions between humans, whether it's social media or property through supply chain, whatever it might be. This technology enables us as a network of interconnected, decentralized groups of people come to consensus without using any threats of violence. And you mentioned your background, with Mises and everything else. I think this is critically important because if we're going to have free voluntary exchange in order to have valid price discovery, so that we as a community can determine what it is we actually value, what it is we spend time away from our family working a job to obtain. If we can't have a clear signal to figure that out, we're going to get very, very distorted markets, and we're going to get situations where people are taken advantage of, and we're going to get situations that are just very unequitable. And so I really like the idea of, when I think about a blockchain, again, it's the best form of money ever invented. It's a really robust, secure, powerful ledger system. And from that, we can determine value by having consensus that's just based on what is it worth to you? What is it worth to me? And from this process, we can actually negotiate and have this emergent property of value. So for me, I think it's going to be the greatest thing for my kids and my kids' kids, the ability to grow up in a world where value isn't determined by whoever has the most force and they're willing to use it, but more so by whoever creates the most benefit to others around them. And that's just a beautiful thing.
I love it. It is definitely a pure manifestation of voluntary markets. It's so cool. So on that note, some of our viewers might not have ever heard any ideas like coercion being a fundamental property of the state and things like that. So could you unpack? Sometimes it's helpful to understand a new thing by comparing it to sort of an old thing. So let's stay in a narrow lane, just for simplicity. Fiat money, like dollar bills or like your government issued currency, versus something like a Bitcoin. If you don't mind, give us a bird's eye view sort of comparison. Why is it better for our viewer to want to have their value stored in something like a Bitcoin versus a US dollar, for example?
It's a really great question. It's almost like Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole. Once you dive into, wait a minute, what are these pieces of paper with the pictures of dead white people on them that I trust? Where does this value come from? And that rabbit hole was many years of study for me. Looking into the world reserve currencies, looking into the initial Federal Reserve coming into being in the early 1900s, to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 44, the Nixon shock in 71, and just kind of figuring out what money is no easy task, but I would highly recommend it to everyone because fiat essentially means by government decree. And there's been, I think, 700 something different fiat currencies. Most of them historically fail, go to zero, literally worth nothing. And the average lifespan, the last time I did a thing on this back, actually, this is data from my presentation in 2013, was about 27 years as a lifespan on average of a fiat currency. And so if you've been following the news and you see what happens in Venezuela and Argentina and these places where they can't prop up the story of value for their government decree currency anymore, everything falls apart. Or if you study history in the Weimar Republic and all these different examples where there's wheelbarrows worth of pieces of paper to try and pay for a loaf of bread, it's just very scary if you care about protecting your family and providing for your family. And the idea that can just be taken away from you at any moment by decree of government is a very scary thing. And most people, I would say in the West and the United States especially, just aren't exposed to this reality. And at the same time, I have friends of mine who've lived in Russia who lived through 3 currency collapses. Like it was just part of their process. Everything goes to zero and we all reset again with some new currency. And so I guess from that standpoint, why a Bitcoin or blockchain cryptocurrency in general is so important is it's not controlled by any single entity. And this is the part that gets a little complicated because it involves cryptography. It involves technology. And as a technologist, I trust this because I understand it. But I can understand it's very difficult for people to trust something when they can't physically hold it in their hands and understand it. Like, wait, I don't quite get it. How is this more secure? And so there is a learning curve to it. And I've had a lot of conversations with people where they're like, well, it should just be easier. And I said, well, it's getting there. But it was like the early internet. It wasn't very easy to use the early internet. And now we have, Netflix and Gmail and, all these wonderful tools that are super simple. So we're getting there, but it's a mechanism where once you can spend a little bit of time understanding the technology, understanding what makes it secure, you can understand that there's no possibility for anyone to come in and just change it. They can't just flip a switch and make all your money go away because it doesn't work that way. It's fully decentralized. And like we said earlier, it's a ledger that can't be modified.
So I totally hear you on the educational piece, and I think that's part of the heart of our show is to help bridge that gap and to spread awareness for this space. And so, if you could, and I know you've probably done this thousands of times, and you've already done it here, in different bits and pieces. But if you could give me the elevator pitch to what is a blockchain and how is that different from something like when we interact with Facebook or YouTube or Visa, or how is that different fundamentally? And the challenge is to give the answer in a way that my mom listening, which she will, is gonna get it, is gonna have that kind of light bulb moment. It's a task that and by the way, there are people that still don't quite understand the internet, right? And it's been around now for so many years, and I still find that we can use something without fully understanding it, and that's fine. And I think cryptos are going to get to that place where we're using it, and most people might not ever understand it. And so I do think it's okay to not fully understand it. But for those who are interested and want to learn and trust it a little more, that bird's eye view, elevator pitch, really digestible. What is the blockchain, and how is it different from other ways to deliver information?
It's an excellent question. It's the most important question. It's also very challenging. I've been trying for 6 years to answer it well. I mean, you probably know I did understandingblockchainfreedom.com, did some videos trying to help people understand. And I've had varying successes. I'm a technologist, so generally I do talk a little more technical than probably your other guests on your show. But I'll try to do my best. And essentially, there are 2 basic concepts that I feel someone does have to understand, which is a database, which is just a place you store information, and a network, which is a way that you transfer information between parties. If you can get those 2 semi-technical terms down of a database and a network, then we could talk about, for example, Facebook, or even like a check clearinghouse. You go to your bank, you write a check and you give it to somebody. Well, they have to go through this central authority, this central database to say, okay, are these bank accounts real? Does this account have the money? Can we take the money out of here and send it over here? Or with Facebook saying, hey, I'm gonna post something on Facebook and hope my friends see it, but they have the ability to just delete it from the database, and they have the ability to prevent certain parts of the network seeing that information based on their own criteria of what's going to maximize their shareholder value or whatever. And so what's beautiful about these systems is that you never have database without network, and you never have network without database, and these are completely decentralized. So unlike the situations we were talking about where you have a third-party counter risk, where I want to interact in some way, I want to send value, or I want to post on social media, or I want to have some kind of record of something that I did, in the centralized system, I have to trust the third party, and that increases risk that information is going to just not be there tomorrow. And if you listen to some of these social media people, they have their accounts demonetized or their accounts removed, and it's very frustrating. That can't happen on a blockchain. The mechanisms for how it works is fundamentally designed so that anyone who's participating in it, they all have the same information. So if you were to update a little bit of the ledger, a little bit of the database, because of that network part of it, someone on the other side of the world gets the exact information that you just updated, and it's provably secure. It can't be tampered with. And that is a powerful, powerful technology. And in the past, another analogy I'll use that I heard once before, if I have something physical, like, this little charger here, and I was to give it to you, well, then you would take it and everyone would know it's now yours. It's your property. And that's easy to do with physical. Whoever controls it physically can control it. If I was to take a picture of this and give it to you, it's very, very difficult to know that you have the real thing, because I could take that picture and send it to somebody else right before you, send it to another person after you. So who really owns the one and only real picture? And that's one of the amazing solutions that the blockchain and cryptocurrency solves, is that you can provably know that you have a digital asset that only you control. And that's done through public and private keys, which is a little more technical. But that's, every time I give that answer, I give a slightly different version of it, because I'm always kind of, and honestly, the best way I've found to do it would be to get to know exactly what your mom is interested in and how she thinks about these things. And that would be the way that I'd handle it, is on an individual one-on-one basis, find that common ground like you're talking about that people are familiar with, and then build off of that. So it's kind of hard to answer that question in a broader context like this.
Yeah, and repetition, right? The more we, if someone knows something well, they should be able to explain it simply. I firmly believe in that, and then of course there is just sort of a gift of teaching, which I see in you. The ability to talk about things and make it easy for people to receive, which is one reason you're here today. Is I think you have that gift, and it's extraordinary. Okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit more narrow focus. So. When I look at the blockchain space, this is sort of my take on it, a little bit of my take on it, but I want to hear your thoughts. It's sort of kind of like the .com era, where you had a lot of speculation, which of course, brought in a lot of resources and tons of interest into the space. But we call it a .com bubble because there was probably a lot of hype and a lot of excitement, and companies crashed. But by no means was that a bad thing. It brought a bunch of people, developers and talent and resources into the space. And ultimately the internet was a good thing, and it didn't go away and it didn't die, and there were huge winners. And I sort of see the blockchain space similarly, that there was this initial hype where a lot of resources came in, a lot of people, a lot of talent, and then there was some significant bubble burstings or whatever, people getting that maybe didn't fully understand the value proposition or what they were committing to, and then they got cold feet and they pulled out. But what I think has happened, at least, is there have been some clever people in the space, developers in particular, that have sort of watched what's worked, what hasn't worked. They've done a few projects, Steam It, for example, and now they're sort of ready to really capitalize with awesome ideas that are going to go the distance and reach mass adoption. That's kind of where I see us, at least, is that these sort of second and third and fourth generation ideas in the blockchain space are going to be the Amazons and the ones that win, that they didn't pop, and so I'd love to hear your from starting in 2009, kind of what do you see as the progression of this thing, and just your commentary. And you don't have to use every company, because there's been hundreds of coins and hundreds of projects, or thousands of projects, but I just want to hear sort of the big ones. If you could maybe talk about Bitcoin and Ethereum, some of the ones that I know my viewers will be familiar with, some of the bigger coins, and then if you could wrap it up with sort of EOS and where you're at now, and how you see that whole thing playing out. I'd love to hear that story.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so many angles to this. Like you said, there's thousands of different cryptocurrencies at this point. And I'll just provide one facet, and I'm sure there's many other facets that you could learn from this. But essentially, Bitcoin was the very first, and it's kind of become kind of the cryptocurrency world reserve currency in a sense. So a lot of projects kind of peg themselves to Bitcoin. And so if the price of Bitcoin goes up or price of Bitcoin goes down, some of those other project currencies are impacted by that. And it's also based on when people want to get into or out of the cryptocurrency space, they're often taking their fiat currency and converting it for Bitcoin, and then maybe going and buying some alternate cryptocurrency. And Bitcoin, it was basically just a way to store and transfer value. That was its kind of first use case for this technology. Now, there were many people that tried to do like color coins and master coin, a lot of different projects to kind of extend the functionality of Bitcoin and enable Turing complete programming, for example, different types of additional functionality. And Vitalik was one of those. Vitalik Buterin, who was involved in inventing Ethereum, eventually came to the conclusion, well, you couldn't really do it efficiently and effectively on that technology. So he invented a smart contract technology in Ethereum. And what that means is basically the ability to write programs and have them run on a blockchain. And that opens up a whole new world of possibility, because you can essentially have decentralized software that can't be shut down by any government or any community or anyone that disagrees with it. It's basically going to run as long as people are adding value to it. And from there, you get the idea of a DAC or a DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization or a decentralized autonomous community or company or corporation. And that's what I've been really passionate about over the last year or so. We'll get to that in a second. But as these things have evolved, they've kind of continually, because most of the major projects are all open source. So these projects are continually, as you were talking about, finding out what works, finding out what doesn't, and evolving and changing and improving over time. And so as Ethereum has found out some things that work and some things that don't, other people have kind of extended it further and saying, well, there's, for example, on Ethereum, you have to pay a gas fee every time that you transact on the blockchain. So with the blockchain, although it's permissionless, anyone can access it and use it, it's also nothing on it can be free. So if I could attack it and just fill it up and make it full of random data, then that would make the value go to zero for everyone. So you have to pay a little bit of fees. And that became a problem because if humans don't like loss aversion, I don't like to have to pay for something to get something of value. And so EOS was kind of an evolution of that. And there's different, they call them consensus mechanisms for how these blockchains secure themselves. One is proof of work, which is what Bitcoin and Ethereum uses. There's also many that are proof of stake, which means if you own a bunch of the tokens, you get to determine how the network is secured. And then kind of one of the more newer ones that were being explored with EOS and Steem and BitShares is delegated proof of stake. And delegated proof of stake basically says those who have skin in the game get to vote for those who are going to secure the network. And those people are in that elected position, and they can be removed at any moment, but they're kind of being put there based on trust that they've built in the community of aligned incentives, saying I'm gonna make sure that my incentives align with the token holders. And what we've seen with proof of work systems, and I witnessed this myself with Bitcoin, when they have the whole block size debate, they're saying, well, how big should the blocks be? And then you had this fork between Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Core, and there was no mechanism on the blockchain itself for determining consensus about the protocol. So we have consensus on what the money is, but then we had to go almost like a fractal deeper down into, okay, now we need consensus on the system itself. And so what's been exciting with projects like I mentioned, EOS, they have the ability to on-chain make decisions about how the system itself will run. And that's done through these smart contracts and through this voting. So I'm very excited about the space. I'm involved in many different projects. I'm not kind of a maximalist. You'll hear that term often as you dig into, and apologize, you'll hear SHIT coins. I don't know if we're allowed to say that on your family-friendly show here. But these different projects, a lot of people will say, well, I like mine only, and they get very tribalistic about what they think is the most valuable tool in this space. And then to try to tell everyone that all the other tools are terrible and they're going to go to zero. I don't take that stance. I think competing money is a beautiful thing. I think that there's going to be different value propositions based on the technology. Certain things are going to become valuable. And I'm not even though I've spent 6 years of my life in this space, I'm not even convinced, for example, blockchains will be the ultimate end all goal. Maybe a directly cyclical graph, a DAG, is another technology that's starting to emerge out of this space. And it's essentially just another way to have that immutable, trusted historic record that can't be modified, that's the same all over the world. So to me, it's a very amazing, incredible space to be in. As a technologist, I just love learning constantly about all the new technologies. But I understand for most it can be a bit overwhelming because they're just like, oh my gosh, I'm just finding out what Bitcoin is, and now I'm hearing about all these new technologies that do new wonderful things. How can I keep up? And it's challenging. A lot of it is just experience and exposure. It's kind of like the first time you drive a car, you're freaking out, because it's so stressful, you don't know what to do. And then after the experiential knowledge grows, it's just super simple, and driving, you don't even think about it. And I think it's going to take some time, but eventually using these different cryptocurrencies, using these different projects is going to be that way. And I was just in DC for the June 1, the Block 1 event where they announced Voice. And that's a project built on the EOS blockchain where everyone's going to have their own social media account that's going to be connected to their actual identity. So there's not going to be trolls and bots and things like that. And it's a really exciting experiment. And those are the kind of things that are going to make using cryptocurrency super easy. Like you said earlier, where people won't even know that they're using a cryptocurrency. They just use an app that's super fun, super familiar. And underneath the hood, they might be potentially creating a groundwork for even like a universal basic resource income or something along those lines, where there's just all these cool experiments we get to try out, things that otherwise wouldn't be possible.
I love it. And so you've led us right into the water where we were headed, and that is a little deeper into EOS, and so I just had some questions, and I'm gonna play it now. I've been learning as much about EOS as I can. I think it's super cool too, and I sort of view it like Dan sort of saw, he learned a bunch, he had some successful projects. Steemit's an awesome project, and so it's like he's already used to being an entrepreneur who creates value in the marketplace, and he kind of exited just the land of abstraction into, okay, I want to put something into people's hands that they can use, and that's accessible. So I sort of view him as an entrepreneur first, which I love about him, that he's wanting to create something that's useful. But then there were some, and so in this case, I'm going to play devil's advocate a bit. There were some things that I wasn't sure about, and so as I've learned more, it's made me sort of have that probably the same aha moment that he had in this process. But still, I'd like to address those things like EOS being inherently inflationary, things like EOS having these 21 block producers, and isn't that centralization? And I kind of already know the answers to these, but I want you to be able to talk about them. So yeah, like why, and also I love what you started to talk about, and I personally want to learn more about this, is how is the software updated? Like, I guess just to a non-tech person, how does that work compared to like Facebook? We'll just compare it to, something that has a centralized server and they push out the update. How does that work? And so I know that's a lot of questions there. But
I'll try to track them all if I can. So there are definitely, like we were saying, it's an experiment. Things are changing all the time, and we're learning as we go. One of the concerns with the kind of lack of decentralization, some people say, well, it's, I even had a tweet thread that went semi-viral responding to someone who was saying that, well, it's just if Amazon Cloud Services had a token, then that would be EOS, that idea that it's centralized. But it's actually very decentralized. These 21 block producers that are elected by the token holders are also backed up by hundreds of other backup producers. And a portion of those are actually getting paid to be in that backup position. And the rest are trying to add value to the community to be voted on to become a backup and or an actual consensus witness. So the level of decentralization is actually far superior when you look at it from a technical standpoint to some of the proof of work systems, where certain hashing farms have massive amount of hashing power, and hashing power is kind of a technical thing that I won't get into too detail, but essentially gives whoever spends a lot of money on electricity and resources gets to control the chain essentially. And in this case, it's not so much how much money you spent on electricity or ASIC computers to mine the cryptocurrency. Instead, it's about how much value you've added to the network and who trusts you to take their stake in tokens and vote for you and make sure that you continue doing a good job in securing the network. So when I saw this problem happening with the Bitcoin network, not able to figure out how they were going to upgrade their block size, as an example, and you have this big fork in the community where some people went to Bitcoin Cash and some people went to Bitcoin, I recognized there was a problem. And I saw it again with Ethereum, where there was this big hack known as the DAO hack. And a lot of people were very upset that they ended up rolling back those changes and kind of recovering people's stolen money, millions and millions of dollars. And people forked off to Ethereum Classic and Ethereum as we know it today. One allowed for that rollback and one didn't. And so it's like these are problems of governance of how do we change this running system that no one gets to control. It's all decentralized. It's just kind of out there running on the internet. And what I get excited about with delegated proof of stake and also DAX as well is that the token holders get to vote to put these people in positions to decide on making the changes. And then those decisions are completely transparent and completely open. And they have to, for example, with Bitcoin or with EOS, you have to have 15 of the 21 block producers agree. And they do that through an on-chain system called a multi-signature transaction. So they get together and say, hey, here's an upgrade. The code has been reviewed. The community likes it. It's gonna change maybe the economics or the fundamental performance of the chain or anything like that. We're gonna submit it. as a proposal. And then those block producers who are elected by their constituents go and they say, yeah, I approve that, I approve that, I approve that. Once you have 15 of them, you can execute it. And then the running code on the blockchain gets upgraded and updated in real time. And it's a pretty amazing thing to see that governance happening. And I remember back in, I think it was 2013, 2014, there was a moment where the Bitcoin blockchain had forked, meaning there were two different versions of reality. And that's a really bad thing. We're not on consensus if we can't agree on what is. And I remember staying up to like 2, 3 in the morning that night in IRC at the time, watching as these communities tried to figure out how to fix it. And they did, and it was really amazing. And I remember telling my wife, oh my goodness, this Bitcoin thing is going to change the world, because for the first time in my life, I've seen, individual selfish actors acting in their own interest, selfishly loving themselves, aligning their motivations with the entire network. And they all shut down their businesses, shut down their exchanges, shut down their wallets and gateways so they could all pause and start over on the same chain. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, this is amazing. But then again, when I saw these kind of infighting in the years after that, I recognized that it's amazing, but can be improved on. And this is where the idea that the token holders get to vote in those decision makers is a really powerful mechanism. And I've seen it work with Steam. I've been involved in that as a Steam witness, one of those block producers. And I've seen it work with EOS as well, with EOS DAC, which is also a block producer, one of those people trusted by the community to secure the network. And so it's just, again, an evolution of this whole space where those who are creating the most value get to have this say in how they protect their values, like the book, Skin in the Game. It's very similar to those motivational principles that enable us to function.
That's awesome. That's really helpful. So a few quick questions. How many block producers are there in Steam versus something like EOS, and why was it arbitrarily decided? Do you see there was a wisdom to it or a method to the madness? What are your thoughts on the number for 21 for EOS, but then and then also how many are in Steam?
It is actually 21 for Steam as well. And I think BitShares might have a slightly different number. I think they've changed it a couple times with BitShares, which is kind of Dan Larimer, who invented a lot of this, started way back with ProtoShares. Then he built BitShares 1.0. Then he built BitShares 2.0. And then he built Steam, the Steam blockchain, which most people think of when they think of steemit.com. But there's really an underlying blockchain that multiple interfaces like busy.org or steampeak.com all interface with. And then he went on to build EOS. So he's kind of evolving, as you said, an entrepreneur would, these different kind of game theory really is what it is. These game theory ideas of how to protect the chain with these different governance models. So I don't personally know where the number 21 came up with. I think it's just kind of a large enough to be decentralized and not small enough to be, too centralized, but also not so big that it becomes not performant, where you just have to get too many people all over the world in different time zones to agree to get anything done. And so I think if it was much more than 21, that would become a challenge. But one of the neat things about what I've personally been involved in for the last year and a half or so is EOS DAC, which is a decentralized autonomous community, block producer owned by the community. And we're building software to help other people build decentralized autonomous communities. And in that, we're able to experiment with some of those numbers, because we also have a base concept of the token holders vote in custodians. Custodians make decisions via multi-signature on what the DAC is going to do and how they're going to evolve and change over time. So we have some that have more DACs or more custodians, some that have less. EOS DAC, for example, only has 12. And that's a number that worked well with our community for the amount of money we're trying to protect and how decentralized we think it needs to be. But these are all ongoing experiments, which is really exciting.
Cool. Yeah, I tend to think there's a lot of wisdom there, whether how thought out it was, but I agree. I mean, as you get big numbers, it confuses a lot of things, and there's a lot of challenges there. And then of course, too small numbers leads me to my next question. And I think I have a pretty solid answer to this, but I think you're gonna even have a better one, and that is, what's to stop that guy with a little white mustache, the monopoly man, from coming in and buying 15 seats, if you will, or that many EOS tokens, and doing his own thing? What's to stop the big trillionaire from coming in and buying the whole community?
It's funny, because I remember in the very early 2013 days when I was first getting excited about Bitcoin, we had the same kind of discussion on Bitcoin Talk forums. And it was like, what if the governments and the central banks just start buying up a bunch of Bitcoin because they can print money out of nothing? And the more we looked into that game theory situation, the more we realized so many of us are so passionately committed to this idea of a tool for freedom that we wouldn't sell. Like as the value goes up and up and up, we just continue to say, we're not going to sell to you. And that essentially kind of exposes the hyperinflationary model of their financial system compared to ours, which is, I would say, a more sound money system. So from that perspective, those same mechanisms of game theory apply in delegated proof of stake as well. As somebody tried to buy up more and more tokens to vote in their own people, the idea being that those who don't want that will prevent it. And also the idea being that if you were to kind of kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, you kill your own value. So if they were to do something like that, that would question the security or decentralized nature of the network, then people would lose trust in the network. So on EOS, for example, there are some concerns that a lot of the block producers are now based in Asia, which is the similar pattern that we've seen with other proof of work systems. A lot of the hashing powers in Asia. And I think a part of that is just their currencies being inflated quite a bit. So they're looking for important ways to store value. And part of it is their culture is very much about saving and also a little bit about speculation. So they're interested in experimenting more so, where in the West, there's a lot of debt. There's a lot, there's not as much of that going on. So I think, these are all a matter of just kind of figuring out, what works and what doesn't as we kind of compare and contrast these different systems. And ultimately, and we've seen this with like Lisk, or, there's certain platforms that haven't survived, or certain systems where they've been what's called a 51% attack, where somebody gets 51% of the hashing power and they're able to undo a transaction that was previously thought to be secured. And so these are kind of the experiments that we're going to run into. And as people do this on these smaller chains with less value in them, we start to learn what works and what doesn't. And the deal behind some of the larger cryptocurrencies, like you mentioned, Bitcoin, Ethereum, EOS, there's so much money on the line, so much money protecting these systems, that it's really getting out of the ability for even nation state governments to stop at this point, because it's this global phenomenon where people are going to value it and protect it with their own funds.
I love it. That was very similar, better said than I could have put it. But yeah, it's hard to, when we start devising these hypotheticals that require people to go against their self-interest, like millions of people to go against their self-interest all at once, it gets silly, which I've heard a lot of arguments like that against a free society. It's always interesting to see what people will come up to in the hypothetical realm. But yeah, that's the answer. They won't sell, right? Why would they sell if they saw that sort of move happening? And I think that's great. And now you mentioned that there were hundreds of sort of behind the scenes. They're all sort of vying for a position in the top 21, and they're all contributing and earning income. And so, explain a little bit now. EOS it doesn't have fees, and so explain a little bit about how that works and who's benefiting from being a block producer, but also and sort of what's in it for them, what's in it for the block producers, and what's in it for those other not the top 21, but the other hundreds of producers, and a little information about that. How many are there? What are you one of those people? Is it easy to do? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a constantly evolving system, so it's really exciting because we're learning as we go. So, for example, EOS has what's called voluntary inflation. It's known, it's not controlled by anyone other than the participants in the network, so everyone can kind of agree, okay, we're all going to get devalued just a little bit in order to provide this security mechanism that increases the value for all of us. So it started out with 5% inflation. And 4% was going to go towards a worker proposal fund, which would fund active development and projects that were valuable to the community. And 1% was going to go to the block producers. And that 1% that goes to the block producers was then further divided into 3/4 of that percent was going to go to, just based on where you are in the rankings of the vote. I think I have that correctly. And then 1/4 of that percent goes directly to the top 21. So the top 21 get paid a nice chunk of money, and then the rest is based on vote. And that includes the top 21. And then there's a cutoff to that, which I think is if you earn enough votes to earn enough of the inflation to get 100 EOS a day, then you're considered a paid backup. If you're underneath that threshold, you get nothing. And so it's kind of a way to keep track of, like, we need a certain level of decentralization, but we don't need to be paying, thousands and thousands of people to run a server that will never get used to secure the network, right? It finds that nice little balance to say, okay, people are taking a risk, they're putting their own money on the line to run these servers and to secure the network, to provide full nodes. But at the same time, they might get that opportunity to get voted in. So EOS DAX, in the case of the organization I'm working with, we were one of the very founding members. We helped launch the chain in the very beginning. We were in the top consensus for quite some time. And now we've kind of dropped out. I think we're, as of today, in position 36. But we're still getting paid. We're not, off the radar completely. We're still a paid backup. But it's one of those continually evolving challenges of saying, okay, how can we communicate the value we're bringing? And how can we, importantly, connect with the stakeholders to let them know, hey, to run a very secure and decentralized and trusted network, you need to have the very best technically excellent people involved. Michael Yates on our team, for example, is well known throughout the community as being really, really valuable from a technical excellence standpoint in securing the network. And so these are things that I'm also running what's called a proxy. So people who don't know which block producers to vote for, they'll set me as a proxy, and I'll do all that research to figure out, which block producers are providing value. And you can vote up to 30 different block producers. And of that, they eventually get to the 21 based on all those different votes. So I definitely encourage anyone who has EOS token to go and set a proxy, myself or Freedom Proxy or Brock Pierce Proxy or Colin Talks Crypto has a great proxy. And there's a lot of really great proxies out there that are doing a lot of good work to find out who the good block producers are. And essentially those positions in the block production are paid by that inflation, but they're also providing a service to the network. They recognize that without them, the network doesn't run, it doesn't stay secure. So it's interesting. As I said earlier, this is an ongoing experiment. So that 4% hasn't been put to use yet. And so there was recently a referendum where they agreed to kind of just burn all those tokens, and they burned millions and millions of dollars worth of EOS tokens because there wasn't yet a use case for it. And they didn't want it just sitting there growing and growing and growing. Now they didn't turn off the inflation, so have that 4% inflation going, but it's really kind of the idea being we're not going to have this money that's not in circulation without a purpose. And so we're hopefully as a community going to come together and actually build out that worker proposal system so that people can, in a trusted way, be able to divert those funds to things that provide value to everyone. And that's part of, again, what I've been working on with EOS DAC, building decentralized, autonomous communities that can manage and have a mechanism for governance for things like that fund. And the whole community that I talk with is really excited about it. I just gave a talk just a few days ago at the Block Producer Summit in San Francisco. And it's just really exciting, very well received what we're working on and how important it is to secure the network.
And I don't want to just breeze over that. Let's just restate that. The holders of the value voted to burn up the currency to preserve the integrity of the network. And imagine a government doing that. I mean, just, isn't that an interesting thing? Like, for me, that is such a awesome testimony of it's just a really cool thing. So for those of you who didn't fully get that, there were millions and millions of dollars of EOS tokens based on this 4% sort of savings pool that was earmarked for development. They probably, it's not inconceivable to think that they could have voted that to themselves, right? I mean, a lot of abuse could have happened. They actually voted to destroy that, to burn it up, to preserve so there wouldn't be this huge influx of supply of new tokens and bring the price down. And just, I think that's a really cool thing that we wouldn't expect a government who's printing fiat money to do anything like that. And so that's pretty neat. Okay, I have a couple more questions. I know we're getting, I like to keep these under an hour, and we're getting close to the end, but you helped me a lot understand, and I know you've helped our viewers a lot. So a couple things to wrap up is I'd love to talk a little bit about voice. Now I have actually two questions, and I want to get really practical. So I'm thinking, again, my mom, my aunts out there, they don't own their own wallets, and they might not ever. They might always keep their investment on something like an exchange like Coinbase. Okay, there's a lot of people that probably just, at least until it's easier for them, they'll probably keep their cryptocurrencies on something like Coinbase. For those users, can they vote for what you guys have going on? Can they point their EOS from Coinbase to a proxy? Or how does that work? Could you help us?
Not currently on Coinbase as an example, but there are some other exchanges that have built actual user interfaces for their token holders to do that. So Binance and I think Huobi have certain tools for that. They're very big proxies, very influential in the EOS system. And one of the talks at the event I was just at, they were saying that it's really kind of our responsibility as a community to provide those voting tools in an open source way to these exchanges so that they can participate. And they can and again, that a lot of these exchanges are dealing with hundreds and hundreds of different coins and projects. They're not going to spend a bunch of time on one of them. But if we come to them and say, hey, here's a very easy to use open source tooling to add voting to your members who really believe in this project, that'll bring you a lot of goodwill with your community within EOS. And so I think that is the future. That's what's going to be happening more. And I think there are going to be different incentive models, like, for example, the REX token, which is an interesting idea that says, hey, you can kind of rent out your EOS, because we didn't really touch on this yet, but in EOS, there is no fees for transferring. You take your token and you put them in a smart contract, you lock them up for like 3 days, 3.5 days, and you then get a certain amount of the shared resources of what I call the shared collaborative commons. There's this operating network that's out there that you can access, and you get to use a bit of it because of your staked tokens. And now with the REX concept, you can actually, and this is just a part of EOS that was added after the mainnet launch, where you can kind of rent out those tokens for others who need those resources to run applications or do anything like that. And then you get a small reward for that. And that that system is designed in such a way that you have to vote for a certain number of block producers or set a proxy in order to get that reward. So they're starting to introduce incentives for people to participate in the governance, which I think is a really good thing.
Yeah, that does make sense. You guys have a massive incentive to provide those things for the exchanges to make it effortless for them. So that's a great perspective. So that was one. Actually, a follow-up question on that, and this is me personally asking. I hope I don't confuse any viewers by this one, but could you help me understand the difference between EOS and Ethereum and I know there's some major differences on sort of transactions per second or bandwidth in terms of what it can produce, but also because of there's no transaction fees. But if you could help me sort of understand the main value proposition. So I'm an Ethereum lover, and you're coming to me, and you got a couple minutes to help me see the light, and so. To join the EOS community, and how would you do that? Not to hate on Ethereum.
Like I said earlier, I'm not a maximalist. I love Ethereum as well. I have friends in Ethereum, and I own Ethereum. It's good to at least explain why I'm passionate about this part of the project, this state in the game. I think there are a number of reasons, me personally, that I really like it. One, again, the consensus mechanism that Ethereum uses is called proof of work, which is kind of based on how much energy you waste, essentially. And when you get to the point where it's wasting too much energy to provide that security to the network, it can be a little excessive. Also, the contracts can't be modified. Once you put out a contract, it's there for life, and you can't really do much about that. The DAO hack I mentioned earlier, where there was millions of dollars lost, it was because there was a bug in the contract code and they couldn't update it, couldn't fix it. Ethereum has that property that EOS doesn't. EOS gives the private key holder of a contract the ability to modify it at any time. Now that creates new problems, because now you need a governance mechanism for saying who has access to these contracts. And this is again why I think a decentralized autonomous community is so important. So elected people get access through multi-signature permissions to modify those contracts. But the other piece is also related to having no fees on the system. With that proof of work, you have to reward those miners they're doing that work with fees. And again, nothing on a blockchain can be free, so there has to be some kind of mechanism to prevent abuse. Whereas with delegated proof of stake, instead of this competitive environment where everyone's working to solve the next block and get that reward, there's this cooperative environment where the elected producers are essentially scheduled. Well, you go next, and then it's my turn, and then you go. It's really efficient, and that's where you get that transaction per second difference that's so significant, because there isn't a competitive environment other than trying to compete for value add so you get voted in. It's about, on a technical level, it's very, very efficient to say, we're going to cooperate and coordinate together. So in that case, instead of having fees, they just take those resources that are kind of locked up in the system and say, well, you can interact with the system, but you have to have some skin in the game. You have to have some tokens that you've locked up in order to do that, to make sure that somebody just flood a bunch of data on the blockchain and make it too expensive to run a node.
Awesome. Yeah, that definitely helps. And just for the viewers, what is the difference between, transactions per second with something? If you don't know these, it's okay. But if you do, something like a Visa, like a traditional credit card company, versus Bitcoin, versus Ethereum, versus EOS, what are we looking at in terms of
Yeah, I definitely don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I know early on it was like, 7 or so transactions per second, in the Bitcoin world. And then when they introduced SegWit and Lightning Network, that went way, way up, but still has some limitations. Whereas, my experience with my previous company, FoxyCart, and the e-commerce shopping cart, we dealt with the acquirers and the credit card processing companies, merchant accounts, and payment gateways, and it was just orders of magnitude more efficient and more transactions per second on the traditional credit card system. So the idea that this incredibly sound money is going to take over the world, the technical performance of it became a very strong hindering to that being a possibility. And same with Ethereum, it had improvements to Bitcoin, but still couldn't process that many transactions. Whereas the EOS IO technology that EOS is built on has the potential. And I was at the Washington, D.C. event just recently where Block One announced a 12x improvement of performance with the technology. And they had, Dan Lerner tweeted just not too long ago, 320 million accounts, kind of an interesting number, like every American on the planet, right? 320 million accounts processing over 1,000 transactions a second, in this environment. And so it's like incredibly performant, not only equal to the task of some of these, global payment processor networks, but actually potentially surpassing. And not only that, providing not just money back and forth, but a full programming language suite of tools to create applications that live on the internet and can't be stopped, which is really an amazing, exciting thing.
That's one of the things I wanted to see for mass adoption was, when you run a credit card or when you're purchasing something with money, 30-second wait time is not a significant wait time. But when you're doing something like a social media interaction, like liking a post or sharing a post or whatever, interacting with something like a piece of content your friend produced, you want that to be instant or feel instant. And so I always saw just limitations there.
Like with Bitcoin, you got to wait 10 minutes for your first confirmation on average. And then to fully know that the money's there, it's an hour. It's actually 6 confirmations. With Ethereum, that's improved. It's a matter of minutes. But even then, it's to really know that it's secure, you have to wait a long time. And then that got improved further, I think, with BitShares and Steam, where you waited 3 seconds, which is nice. You're like, okay, within 3 seconds, you can kind of have a little pause in your upvote, and now it shows up. And EOS is a half a second. So it's actually 500 milliseconds between individual blocks. And when someone says blocks, all they really mean is a group of transactions that are included in this process of adding to this database that can't be modified, this immutable ledger. And you kind of add them as blocks, as groups of information. And each one of those pieces of information kind of informs how the next piece of information can be added. And that way you can't change anything about the entire history of the chain. If you did, it would be noticed by everyone and the whole system would be invalid. So it's a really beautiful mechanism for keeping things secure. And the way delegated proof of stake does it with that cooperative model, you can do it very, very fast. And so you do have these opportunities like voice.com, like these, social interactions that are just super seamless and what people are used to today.
Yeah, that's very cool. A clarifying question for me personally again. So you had mentioned that with EOS, we have the ability to change the software and not have these splits in the chain, like not have these separate ledgers or fork, hard forks. When the software changes, can the past ledger be changed at all, or is that immutable? Like, do I understand that that's immutable forever? But when we do change the software and how the economics of it work or whatever, it's just a future. It can't actually retroactively change, like with the Ethereum and the Ethereum Classic split where they went back and they reversed bad behavior. Can software changes do that same thing in EOS, or is that not even a possibility?
It's a great question because it does get a little bit into the technical weeds, but I think it's an important question because it creates the distinction between a software change and what's called a hard forking change. So hard forks generally people think of as like two different communities going in different directions. Technically, on a blockchain, a hard fork is something where you make a change that's incompatible with the previous running nodes. So that can include changing history. And that is something that can be part of that because often a hard fork requires what's called a full replay. So you sit there and you actually kind of go from the beginning block all the way through under this new set of rules for consensus. And you kind of evolve all the way forward to the present block number and say, okay, now I have a new version of what is history. And so that's certainly possible. And, for Steam, for example, we've had, 20 different hard forks on Steam. all these, 1920, all these different changes to the protocol that the community elected producers that they agree with and support to make those changes. So these were all good changes. These are all changes that the community wanted to make. And I think that's important because a hard fork itself shouldn't be bad if it's what the community wants, right? If everyone's sitting and going, no, we're not going to do automobiles. It's just, we're not going to do it. We're going to stick with our buggy whips. We're going to keep doing horse and buggy. And if there was just no way to change that, we're not going to hop in planes and fly off the earth. That's crazy. If there wasn't an ability to evolve and change, then we would be limited essentially in what we could do. So I like that delegated proof of stake has a mechanism for deciding within the community, okay, these are really important changes. They might include actually rewriting some aspects of history. Are we okay with that? And there's an example in the Steam situation where how they deal with resource credits. That was a change in a really important hard fork. And the community had to come to agreement on that. And it kind of changed how much of the resources someone could use based on how much stake they put in the system. And these are all really fascinating economic experiments and dealing with human motivational psychology too, of how they engage with the experiments. So it's hard forks and understanding the difference between soft fork and hard fork. They're all very technical distinctions. But again, this is why it's great to have a good proxy or a good block producer you trust who can kind of break those down for you and explain those ideas.
Excellent. And for any of our EOS holders out there that wanted to use you as a proxy, how do they do that? Give us a little bit of a plug here for Luke Stokes.
Sure. Yeah. Any of the wallets that you'll use, almost all of them support setting a proxy nowadays. So whether that's EOS Voter by Greymass or their new version called Anchor that's coming out, or even just the website blocks.io hooks in with your Ledger or Anchor or Scatter. Scatter Desktop is a very popular wallet, and they all kind of have this functionality to add a proxy. My proxy is Luke EOS Proxy. That's the name of the account. Right now, I think the last I checked had about 3.3 million EOS tokens that are backing that proxy, kind of showing trust in the decisions I'm making for selecting block producers. And it's pretty easy to do. Once you actually get used to using EOS and see that half-second transaction time, using like EOS Links wallet, for example, you just put your thumbprint on there and it transfers. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's so easy. For those of us who've been in this space for a while, it's almost magical because it was so hard to use cryptocurrency early on, especially.
Awesome. And so I love to end with what's next. Give us some vision for you personally. Where are you headed, and what are you working on now? You've talked a little bit about, but what are you most excited about in 2019?
I'm definitely excited about all the amazing projects showing up in the space. I do some, as do some consulting at lukestokes.info. There are different projects I work with that have me on retainer. I'm very active with EOS Stack. I'm so active as a Steam witness as well, working with that community. But I'm also working on something called the FIO Foundation, the FIO.Foundation, the Foundation for Inter Wallet Operability. And they've asked me to come on board as kind of like a part-time CTO. I work with their team pretty much every day. And we're making cryptocurrency easier to use. So eventually, very soon, hopefully this year, this is recorded 2019, we'll have the FIO integrated in most wallets. So like, for example, the Edge wallet, the Binance Trust wallet, the Red wallet, Konami wallet, a lot of different blockchain wallets are supporting the FIO Foundation, FIO protocol. And it'll make it so you could just like send any cryptocurrency to anyone else with a really easy human readable name. So instead of, some complicated hash, it'll just be Luke Stokes, something like that, where the Stokes domain will have Luke as an address and you could just send me EOS or Ethereum or Bitcoin or whatever. And so I think like the two major problems in this space is managing your private keys, custodial management of keys. That's going to be very difficult. And Block One, they just had their announcement about the YubiKey integration. So that's hopefully improving. And the other is just the usability, the wallets and exchanges and payment gateways, usability of not being able to, for example, do a request. And this is the FIO Foundation, FIO protocol will do that as well. So you can have e-commerce going and say, I want to buy this, this, and this, and it just shows up in your wallet and you have all the metadata and it's a trusted, you're going to send it to the right person, like that key exchange happened nicely and you can just approve it and pay for it. So I'm excited about usability improvements. I think that's a big part of mass adoption. And that's been what I've been excited about from day one is just mass adoption of this technology because I really do believe it has a tremendous opportunity to improve human well-being on the planet.
I agree there, man. Well, it has been an awesome privilege to have you on. I'm so excited to share everything with our community. I'm going to leave links in the description for everything, and I'll get some links from you, Luke, just to make sure I don't miss anything. But if you guys want to get a hold of Luke Stokes, that was lukestokes.info. Is that right?
Yeah, lukestokes.info. I'm on Twitter at Luke Stokes. I'm on Steam at Luke Stokes. yeah, I'd love to reach out and talk to your community. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome, guys. Well, this has been Lucas Bessie with Crypto Made Simple, and we'll see you guys next time.